Our journey begins in 1944, in the small town of Alcaloo, South Carolina. George Stinney was just 14 years old, a boy with a shy smile and a love for playing outside. But his life took a tragic turn when two young girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, were found brutally murdered. The town was in shock, and fingers quickly pointed at George, the son of a black sawmill worker. George was taken into custody, interrogated for hours without his parents or a lawyer present. He was small for his age, scared, and alone. The police claimed he confessed, though no written or signed confession was ever produced. The trial lasted just one day. An all-white jury deliberated for only 10 minutes before sentencing George to death.
He was sentenced to die in the electric chair. On June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was executed in the electric chair at the South Carolina State Penitentiary. Due to his young age and small frame, the mask used to cover his face was too large, causing it to slip during the execution. When asked for his last words, he simply said, "No, sir."
On June 16, 1944, George Stinney became the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. He was so small that they had to place a Bible on the electric chair for him to sit on. Decades later, in 2014, his conviction was overturned. But for George, it was too late. Fast forward to 1977 in Lafayette, Louisiana. Dalton Prejean was 17 years old when he made a decision that would change his life forever. During a traffic stop, Dalton shot and killed a state trooper, Corporal Donald Cleveland. Dalton had a troubled past, raised in poverty, abused as a child, and struggling with intellectual disabilities. But none of that mattered in the eyes of the law. Dalton was tried as an adult and sentenced to death. For 13 years, he sat on death row, waiting for an execution that seemed inevitable. On May 18, 1990, Dalton was executed by lethal injection. He was 30 years old, but in many ways he was still the same lost 17-year-old boy who never had a chance to turn his life around. In Amarillo, Texas, in 1981, a horrific crime shook the community. Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old nun, was found raped and murdered in her convent. The police arrested Johnny Frank Garrett, a 17-year-old with a history of mental illness. Johnny confessed to the crime, but his confession was riddled with inconsistencies. He later claimed it was coerced. Johnny was sentenced to death and spent over a decade on death row. He maintained his innocence until the very end. On February 11, 1992, Johnny was executed by lethal injection. Years later, DNA evidence that could have exonerated him was never tested. To this day, many believe Johnny Frank Garrett was innocent. In 1975 in Amarillo, Texas, 17-year-old Charles Rumbaugh walked into a jewelry store with a gun. What started as a robbery turned into a murder when Charles shot and killed the store owner, Paul Bauer. Charles had a history of trouble. He was in and out of juvenile detention centers, struggling with mental illness and substance abuse. Charles was sentenced to death and executed on September 11, 1985. He was the first person in the modern era to be executed for a crime committed as a juvenile. His death sparked debates about the morality of executing those who were still children when they committed their crimes. In 1993 in Houston, Texas, 17-year-old Glen McGinnis was involved in a robbery that turned deadly. Glen and his accomplices targeted a convenience store, but when the store clerk resisted, one of them shot and killed her. Glen claimed he was not the shooter, but under Texas law, he was just as responsible. Glen was sentenced to death and executed on January 25, 2000. He was 24 years old. His case raised questions about the fairness of holding juveniles accountable for the actions of others, especially when they are not the ones who pulled the trigger. In 1990, in Newport News, Virginia, 17-year-old Douglas Thomas and his 16-year-old girlfriend Jessica Wiseman made a decision that would haunt them forever. Jessica's parents disapproved of their relationship, and in a moment of desperation, the two teenagers decided to kill them. Douglas shot Jessica's father, while Jessica killed her mother. Douglas was tried as an adult and sentenced to death. He was executed on January 10, 2000. Jessica, because she was a minor, received a lighter sentence. Douglas's case highlighted the complexities of juvenile relationships and the devastating consequences of impulsive decisions. In 1985 in San Antonio, Texas, 17-year-old Ruben Cantu was accused of a robbery and murder. The key witness, Juan Moreno, identified Ruben as the shooter. Ruben maintained his innocence, but he was convicted and sentenced to death. Ruben was executed on August 24, 1993. Years later, Juan Moreno recanted his testimony, saying he had been pressured by police to identify Ruben. Another man even confessed to the crime. But for Ruben, it was too late. His case remains one of the most controversial in Texas history. In 1995 in Fort Worth, Texas, 17-year-old Toronto Patterson was involved in a carjacking that turned deadly. Toronto and his accomplices shot and killed a man, Michael Brzezinski, during the robbery. Toronto had a history of abuse and neglect, but the jury showed no mercy. Toronto was sentenced to death and executed on August 28, 2002. He was 24 years old. His case highlighted the systemic issues that often lead young people into lives of crime, poverty, abuse, and a lack of opportunity. In 1994, in Grapeland, Texas, 17-year-old Napoleon Beazley was a star student and athlete with a bright future. But one night, he and his friends decided to steal a car. The plan went horribly wrong when they shot and killed the car's owner, John Luddig, the father of a federal judge. Napoleon was sentenced to death and executed on May 28, 2002. His case sparked national outrage, with many arguing that his youth and potential for rehabilitation should have spared his life. In 1981 in Amarillo, Texas, 17-year-old Kelly Pinkerton was involved in a crime spree that ended in murder. Jay and his accomplices broke into a home, where they shot and killed 2 people. Jay had a chaotic upbringing, marked by abuse and instability. Jay was sentenced to death and executed on May 15, 1986. He was 24 years old. His case raised questions about the role of environment in shaping behavior and whether the death penalty is an appropriate response to juvenile crime. In 1986 in Oklahoma City, 16-year-old Sean Sellers shocked the community when he killed his mother and stepfather. Sean claimed he was possessed by demons and had multiple personalities. He was diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, but the jury still sentenced him to death. Sean was executed on February 4, 1999. He was 29 years old. His case highlighted the intersection of mental illness and the death penalty, raising questions about whether we should execute those who are mentally ill. The stories of Dalton Prejean, Johnny Frank Garrett, Charles Rumbaugh, Glen McGinnis, Douglas Thomas, Ruben Cantu, Toronto Patterson, Napoleon Beazley, Kelly Pinkerton, Sean Sellers, and George Stinney remind us of the human cost of the death penalty, especially when applied to juveniles.